Thank you, Senator. I wanted to start with a topic that you touched on. You mentioned the emissions of methane from oil and natural gas drilling. And that leads into the broader question of climate change, another topic you, of course, have been very active on for quite a long time. What signal do you think it would send internationally if the U.S. were to lift or ease its restrictions on crude oil exports at a time when we're gearing up for the Paris conference on climate change, and if there's an agreement struck in Paris, it will be time to implement that? Would that cause other countries to sort of lose faith in the kind of climate change commitment of the United States?
Well, you know, there's an old saying that you can't preach temperance from a bar stool. You can't have a beer in your hand and tell Junior drinking's bad for you. You can't have a cigar in your mouth and saying smoking's bad for you. So to the extent to which this additional fracking takes place in our country, which so obviously runs contrary to the consumer interests in our country, but invokes all of these additional environmental concerns, I think would cause many around the world to cast an arched eyebrow towards this preaching that we're doing. And so especially in the same context where the solar tax breaks are dying, the wind tax breaks have already died, there's no efforts to actually have some national standards for building construction across the country to reduce energy consumption. So it looks more and more like it's just not all of the above strategy, but an oil above all strategy. And that there doesn't appear to be any other strategy but an oil strategy. And that fossil fuel strategy is, of course, something that we're trying to tell the rest of the world is something by the end of the 21st century we just have to have changed.
Politically, then, you mentioned the wind and solar and other green energy tax provisions. If this train is somehow leaving the station, do you think that you would be able to, perhaps salvage isn't the right word, but are you open at all to some type of agreement in which, as I asked Senator Heitkamp, that relaxation of the ban is somehow tethered to extension of the ITC or the PTC or other provisions?
Well, this is a permanent relaxation of the ban on the exportation of oil from the United States. So are you talking about a permanent extension of the wind tax breaks, a permanent extension of the solar tax breaks? Are you talking about the oil industry not opposing the continued increase in the fuel economy standards of the vehicles which we drive? Because they come up for review, by the way, in 2017. They don't go all the way to 54.5 without that review. You know the chance of that happening? I wish there was a number -0, okay? But the oil industry wants to keep their tax breaks. The fossil fuel industry wants to keep their tax breaks and make sure that the other tax breaks die. Because ultimately, those newer technologies, wind and solar, and that whole panoply of new issues is, in fact, what they fear the most. It's the true competition in the marketplace. So it's a wonderful, I guess, theoretical discussion which we can have. But in the real world, that's not happening. That's why this one issue has been pulled out of the energy bill, because there can't be any grand deal that is inside the larger energy bill, because there's just no way that the coal industry is going to allow for wind and solar to get those tax breaks without a huge fight. The auto industry and the industry will be talking about how difficult it will be technologically to continue to meet the increased fuel economy standards. So having done this for such a long period of time, I realize that that's highly unlikely to happen. I don't think there's any scenario under which we could imagine the fossil fuel industry to support a national renewable electricity standard for the whole country. Those are the kinds of concessions you would have to get. And those concessions, in my opinion, as long as the Republicans control the House and the Senate, are pretty much non-existent.
So long-term or permanent extension of renewable credits as well as an RES, renewable electricity standard, continued strong progress on fuel economy standards. How much of your caucus do you think is with you on that? If presented with a vote on crude exports, how much of your caucus would set the bar where you have set it?
I just don't think that offer is coming forward. I mean, it's a beautiful discussion, you know. Who would win a fight, Superman or Batman? Okay, it's a fascinating discussion for a 5-year-old to have. Okay, it's a great discussion, but that offer is not going to be put on the table. Okay, it just isn't going to happen. No, the reason it's teased out is that they want to figure out if they can put this thing together, you know, with the minimum number of Democratic votes in order to pass it. But, you know, the polling says that 70% of Americans do not want to export American oil, do not want to export American oil. So that polling number sits over there. The American public gets this. You know, this is, you know, Mark Twain used to say that history doesn't repeat itself, but it does tend to rhyme. So this might not be exactly 1975, but when people look over at the Middle East right now, it rhymes with 1975 in terms of that mess that exists and the role that oil plays in that entire region. And that's why the polling is so high in opposition to it. And so that's, I would say, the main obstacle, because there's no guarantee that every Republican is going to vote to lift that ban. These numbers are going to be astoundingly high in states that do not have fossil fuel production.
Be blunt about it. Do you have the votes to fight off crude export legislation?
Well, they talked briefly about adding the repeal to the Defense Authorization Act just about 2 months ago. And they retreated. And I don't think they retreated because they wanted to. I think they had to make an assessment as to whether or not they had the votes at that particular point in time, the proponents of the lifting of the ban. So I think they were counting heads as well. And again, as I'm saying, this is not necessarily all Republicans plus a handful of Democrats. Don't think for a second there aren't going to be some Republicans that are going to have to really seriously consider whether or not they want to dramatically increase consumer costs for oil in our country in order to benefit the oil industry from a small number of fossil fuel producing states. That's a very difficult vote.
That said, you know, you've got some moderate Democrats, and I know it's not, as you've just been walking us through, it's not necessarily all Republican, but a lot of Republicans. And within the last couple of years, you've seen a lot of, you know, organizations like, you know, the Brookings Institution, or at least several of their analysts, Bipartisan Policy Center, Center for New American Security. I mean, I guess what I'm asking is, can your allies on this kind of withstand the combined weight of think tank nation plus a lot of Republicans plus conservative Democrats? I mean, it seems like support for this is growing. Are you going to be able to, how convinced are you can hold that line?
It's a tough fight. It's a tough decision. Think tank nation versus the nation. I mean, who would win that? Okay? The Beltway groupthink, or ordinary consumers being told that their gasoline prices are going up, their home heating oil prices are going up because the ban on exports has been removed, and that experts are saying that, you know, this could lead to profits from $15 to $30 billion a year more for the oil industry. Which side of the debate do you want to be on? Okay, so I'll take my side. I think it's held steady for 40 years, and I think there's a strong presumption that that will stay in place in a public debate, in a real debate, not a clandestine, how can we stick this onto some must-pass piece of legislation approach. Okay, but a straight-out debate on this issue, I feel very comfortable that the status quo ante will be retained.
How much has the Iran negotiation and the survival of the White House deal shaken up the politics of this? Because certainly you've got the proponents saying, look, if we're opening the door to much greater Iranian exports, given the removal of sanctions, we should reciprocate on the U.S. side. I mean, does that argument hold sway? I'm guessing it doesn't with you, but do you think that the Iran deal has kind of somehow shaken up the kind of politics and debate on this?
Well, that's the beauty of, the industry. They can argue it either way. They could argue, well, if there is no Iran deal, and Iran's not going to put their oil out on the open market, and we're going to put even tougher restrictions on the Iranians, maybe reducing them down from, we dropped them from 2.5 million barrels a day down to 1 million barrels a day under the sanctions, and we were going to drop them now, let's just say if the deal died, down to 1 million barrels a day. That, of course, people would argue, as the nation that led that effort to kill the deal, we should sell more oil on the open market so our friends are not harmed. But of course, that didn't happen. The deal did pass. And so the Iranian oil is going on the market. So then the very same people then turn and go, oh, the oil is going on the market. Well, here's our argument now. Iran is now selling more oil on the open market. Is it fair that we're not able to sell the additional oil that we can produce in the United States on the open market? So they can argue it either way. The whole point is they just want to go and do it. And at the end of the day, the pressure to keep the price low is intensifying. It's like a tax break in the pockets of consumers all across the country, which they're going to need. What's going on in China is very uncertain in their stock market, their economy as a whole. We should keep that economic stimulus inside our economy generally, and I think the argument fails that the Iranians are now selling oil and therefore we should do it because, remember, we're still importing 1.5 million barrels a day from the Persian Gulf, 5 million barrels totally, 2.5 million barrels a day from OPEC. It is just absolutely nonsensical for us to accept such an illogical argument.
I know you know Senator Schumer, of course, we're both Northeastern senators. To what extent have you gotten a read from him on where he stands? I have not been, perhaps it's out there in the public record and I just missed it, but I don't really know where Chuck Schumer stands on exports. Have you had conversations with him about it?
Well, I don't want to go down individual senators and go down the checklist because there's another 5 names right after that that you could ask me about. But let me just say that I have full confidence in the ability of consumers to elicit an enthusiastic response in the protection of their ability not to have a dramatic increase in the price of gasoline at the pump. It's pretty much the only price, by the way. No one actually knows what they pay for bread or milk anymore. They're going in for 2% milk or whole milk or whatever, but the price kind of eludes them. The only price they know is that price of gasoline as they're just staring at it for 2 minutes while they're holding that pump. And so to the extent to which the price of oil is going to go up, I think it'll elicit a significant enthusiastic response from those who have a history of protecting consumers.
You've long had a leadership role, well, certainly in the House, but more recently in the Senate. You're working with a couple different kind of ad hoc caucuses on climate change. I know there's the Tuesday meetings sometimes. How much of a discussion among, say, the Climate Action Task Force and other sort of climate hawk senators is there about this issue in particular?
Well, again, it rises as an issue when it's pending. So when we were potentially confronted with it in the defense bill, of course, it arose. When we were confronted with a related issue on the Keystone Pipeline in January of this year, it comes up. Of course it's related. Okay? You can't talk about oil and gas in isolation and not be talking about all these other huge issues that actually reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere being simultaneously ignored. You just can't do it that way. And so that's where we are right now. And every time it comes up, there's no question, I ring the bell and I say, we've got to engage this right now. And so it is directly related, there's no question about it, to the totality of a discussion about where the United States is going to be on its emissions of greenhouse gases. Mind you, right now, the Republican Party has already made it quite clear they're going to kill if they can, the president's power plant rule on the floor of the House and Senate. So that's the context in which we debate all of these issues. There's still a substantial percentage of the Republican caucus that does not believe that the warming of the planet is substantially related to human activity. And that's a part of this whole discussion that we could just go off on for another half an hour if we wanted to, but it's part of it. You can't deny it.
Do you plan to go to, speaking of climate change, do you plan to go to the climate negotiations in Paris?
I plan on going. William Shakespeare used to say that the will is infinite, but the execution is confined. So my will is to go. My ability to execute on this is dependent upon the schedule which Mitch sets for activity on the Senate floor. And
sure.
Of that, I have absolutely no knowledge at this point in time. But assuming that the time is there, I am definitely going to go.
One of the questions that came in on social media makes the point that, you cited some of the analysis by Barclays. Senator Heitkamp was citing other studies. Certainly, we've got, I mentioned the EIA study. How is the voter or the consumer, the member of the public who is following this debate, given the number of dueling or conflicting analyses, and again, a substantial number of them showing that this will not force prices up at the pump, but as you pointed out, there are studies showing, an analysis showing the opposite. How would you recommend, how does someone decide, how does someone vet this information? What would you recommend?
You have to read them both and then decide which you think is more accurate. We're not, on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. There's different phases where you can call the expert, or you can call your most knowledgeable friend. But then you reach a point where you can just ask the audience. And the audience was almost invariably right. That was the amazing thing about the show, huh? Almost invariably right. So there's a point in time, we haven't reached that phase of the show yet. We ask the audience. This is still kind of an insider's discussion. But when you present both of these arguments to the public at the right time, whenever that is, I don't decide that. That's going to be decided by the Republican leadership when it's framed. We'll have enough information that's in the hands of ordinary voters where they'll be able to make up their mind as to which side intuitively they think is right. And I think actually the numbers that EIA has on what the impact is for the exportation of natural gas for consumers is going to, which is a 50%. So we just export half of the natural gas that is already, licensed. That's pretty much the way an ordinary consumer will be voting, and then as voters, they'll be reflecting that in any national polling that is taking place, and then their elected representatives will have to factor that into how they want to vote, especially if we're doing it nearer the middle of this winter. I think it's a tough vote.
You mentioned that when Republican leadership decides to put this out there, certainly opponents of it have any number of different channels, both lawmakers who are opponents of it, but also advocacy organizations who work on this, have environmental groups, have consumer groups. Has this been a big enough priority for the opponents? Because certainly all of these organizations are working on a whole litany of topics. Has there been enough of a push to get your view on this out there into the public?
Well, you tend to fight these issues one at a time as they're peaking, as their time on the floor of the House and Senate have arrived. But the environmental groups oppose the lifting of the ban. Consumer groups oppose the lifting of the ban. The AFL-CIO, led by the steel workers, opposed the lifting of the ban. And so that'll be on one side, and then on the other side you'll have the oil industry. Okay? And then ultimately that will be the frame, and within that we'll go through the individual sub-arguments that I just listed over here. But don't for a second think that the public thinks that oil's just like any other product. Okay? If we were still importing 30% of all the corn that we consume in America, 30% of all the wheat that we consume in America, do you think we'd be talking about exporting corn or exporting wheat? That wouldn't be happening. Again, it's not like a widget. It's not like a screwdriver. It's not like something else that's just an ordinary product being exported. This is different. And it's only going to intensify as these stories dominate the top of the news every single night. These were refugees fleeing the Middle East, which is where the discretionary barrel of oil in the world is still located. Okay? And don't think for a second that that's not being burned deeply into the soul of voters across this country.
Well, Senator, we're out of time. I want to say thank you very much for being here and speaking and taking questions.
Thank you, Ben. It's my honor to be here with you all. Thank you.
Thank you.